Now, recently I challenged the biomedical community to show me studies on HIV transmission which provide some evidence that transmission of the virus is possible through intact mucosa. Intact mucosa. Nowhere do I doubt in any way that there is HIV and that it causes AIDS and that it enters the body via some mucosa in sexual transmission. But all I doubt is that it enters the body through intact mucosa. I entertain the view that no clinical studies supporting this view exist, because to put it bluntly, you cannot have a physician check for paper cuts or tears in the anus or rectal mucosa or in the vagina after every instance of sexual intercourse. And the tears, the paper cuts, may heal very fast, as I observed in self-experiments. 1 to 3 days, they're healed and you don't see them anymore. The HIV virus is a perfect hider. It hides in many, many, many ways. It hides on a cellular level. It hides clinically because it takes, 5, 10, 20 years before you have AIDS. Or before you have, or 5 to 10 years before you have any noticeable signs of infection and of immune deficiency. And also, you cannot take rectal or vaginal biopsies of serodiscordant couples all the time and check continuously which cells of the mucosa some HIV particles may have reached, or whether they have reached adjacent lymphatic tissue in the gut or reached the lymph nodes, because that biopsy taking could easily increase the likelihood of infecting the patient. Now, as I had already expected, nobody in the biomedical community communicated with me and offered me some studies showing that HIV transmission is possible through intact mucosa. So I did that homework myself. Again, looked for such studies. I did not stumble upon any during all my research that has been going on for about 4 years now. And now I did some additional research, and I did now find some studies which come close to what I would consider as evidence, or which are candidates for evidence for the hypothesis that mucosal transmission is possible, where the mucosa stays intact. Now, I did not find any clinical studies on humans, but I did find some studies on transmission in humanized mice. Humanized mice in HIV research are mice who either had no immune system of their own, they had some kind of severe combined immunodeficiency, and so did not have any immunological or immunologically important cells, or they only had myeloid cells, but did not produce lymphocytes because of some mutation. And these mice were used for HIV infection research. The other mice were who did not have any immune system in a way. They if I understand it correctly, they were used for pathogenesis, for HIV pathogenesis. But the mice that lacked lymphocytes, they were used for studying HIV infection as well. They were transplanted. This is how that worked. I won't talk too much about how they humanized the mice, because it's not my topic and would take me too much time. So they did not have lymphocytes of their own, and so they were transplanted human hematopoietic stem cells, CD34 stem cells, which then gave them human lymphocytes, which HIV then could, in principle, infect. And now they could indeed successfully infect these humanized mice rectally and vaginally with HIV and give them a systemic HIV infection. But the way in which they did that in all these studies actually lends support to my theory of HIV transmission relying on mucosal injury, rather than these studies would falsify that theory. Moreover, or even worse, these studies seem to transfer the human anal and vaginal taboos, but especially the anal taboo, and preconceptions about it or about anal intercourse. They seem to transfer these taboos even to the mice. And they also seem to transfer the taboo of sexual trauma or sexual injury, mucosal injury during sex. They seem to transfer that human taboo even to the mice as well. And these studies also seem to apply the, I think, possibly or very plausibly wrong assumptions about human HIV transmission to the poor mice. Now, a first quote from a review on these infection studies, Denton and Garcia, 2011. They say the mucosal transmission of HIV in CD4 positive cell transplant, that's those hematopoietic stem cells, in CD34 positive cell transplanted NSG mice has not been addressed in the literature. However, so this is a different kind of humanized mouse model. However, mucosal transmission has been examined in CD34 positive cell transplanted DKO mice, double knockout mice. This is probably what caused that mutation that made them lack lymphocytes of their own. Particularly, in the case of rectal exposure in this model, there is a discrepancy in the literature, they say, regarding their susceptibility to HIV transmission. Among the 4 research groups that have examined the human reconstitution of these mucosal tissues described above, only 2 groups have attempted either vaginal or rectal HIV transmission in these mice. So what they mean to say is probably that there are only 2 groups that tried both vaginal and rectal transmission, because there is at least one further study. Denton is also an author of that study, where they tried only rectal transmission. Now, vaginal HIV transmission has been shown to be efficient, they say here, in this model twice by the same group. 20 out of 21 mice could be infected. However, when both groups attempted rectal HIV transmission in CD34 positive cell transplanted double knockout mice, the results were entirely different. Now, they cite the wrong paper here. They cite a paper that didn't do any rectal or vaginal transmission, but they cite a paper that only involved an intraperitoneal infection. They injected it into the mouse's belly and not vaginally or rectally. They mean another study here. They cite the wrong paper. Now, in one case, transmission was efficient in the first study, which they cite wrongly. In one case, transmission was efficient. 11 out of 14 mice could be infected rectally, while rectal transmission was rare in the other report, regardless of whether inoculation occurred with cell-free or cell-associated HIV. They only had 1 out of 23 mice that they could infect. Only 1 could be infected out of 23. Now, in this second report, the authors also unsuccessfully attempted to increase rectal HIV transmission in these mice by rectal administration of interleukin-1 beta 24 hours preceding viral exposure in the presence or in the absence of human seminal plasma. Yes, they even injected human seminal plasma, semen without sperm. Otherwise, a mouse man would have come out from the male mouse, of course. I should mention as well that the mice were not very well humanized here, because the gut was not very well engrafted. Human lymphocytes did not really move to the gut tissue, to the tissue of the gastrointestinal organs. Yes, they put that pro-inflammatory cytokine, this interleukin-1 beta, in there, and still could not infect the mice. They gave them another agent which did induce colitis even, but still they could not infect the mice very well. And they even added the seminal fluid in order to make it more similar to the human case, but still that didn't work. And also, in this study where it didn't work, they didn't specify how the mouse was inoculated or how the rectum was inoculated, how the virus was exactly injected into the rectum. Now, my first judgment would immediately be, before discussing the details of the studies further, would immediately be that this humanized mouse model is pretty inadequate as a model for human HIV transmission, because in humans, at least in the rich countries or in Caucasians, we observe that the rectal transmission or that the anorectal transmission of HIV is much more likely, is much easier than the vaginal transmission. So it would actually surprise, or we should wonder whether this is an adequate model if vaginal transmission is easier than rectal transmission. It's inadequate as a model in the first place. This is the first point I would like to make. The humanized mouse model is inadequate because actually in all the studies, even where they could infect the mice rectally, they mentioned that it was easier to infect vaginally than rectally. So this doesn't fit. In some studies on the immunological capacities of human breast milk, for example, in human breast milk and antiretrovirals dramatically reduce oral HIV transmission in BLT humanized mice, bone marrow, liver, thymus transplant humanized mice. And there they even managed to infect the mice via the oral cavity or via the upper digestive tract through the stomach. And this also is not a very adequate model for humans, where oral infection with HIV is rather rare, except in the child, but this is not too clear either how that happens in the child through breastfeeding. There have recently been some studies showing that regular breastfeeding has a protective effect against infection. To me, it almost sounds like a perfect parallel to my hypothesis about sexual transmission, because I also think that regular intercourse protects against transmission rather than increasing the likelihood of transmission. William of Ockham keeps appearing to my mind with a message that it's maybe the same explanation. Once mothers take longer breaks between breastfeeding, their milk has a higher viral load because of inflammation and so on. Maybe even because of minor bleeding. And don't forget, I think many things in HIV transmission research are obvious but not really discussed that much. Don't forget that the child has some minor physiological bleeding when it's teething. Actually, once there are so many explanations for a single entity, you can almost justify the suspicion, or that almost justifies the suspicion that a theory is wrong in science. It's when there are many. This is actually Occam's tenet. You shouldn't assume a multitude of explanations without necessity. It's always suspicious when there are many different theories, or when people use many different theories in order to explain few or even one phenomenon. Think about maybe the flop of the century of the last century in medicine, peptic ulcer disease. What causes it? Well, it's psychological stress that causes it, or it's too much acid that causes it, or it's anxiety. It's really a psychosomatic disease, and going to work by bicycle, that's what causes it. And bile reflux and changes in the resistance, in the mucosal resistance. And also smoking, that's what causes it. And your genes, heredity, that's what causes peptic ulcer disease. And bad food, spicy food, or only having 2 meals a day, that's what causes peptic ulcer disease. Or poverty. They did the same thing to peptic ulcer disease. It's the socio-economic conditions. It's social conditions that are responsible for peptic ulcer disease. Poor people have more peptic ulcer disease. And the same thing is happening with HIV now. It's incarceration that causes that epidemic in blacks in America. Incarceration of men. Or that rape epidemic in South Africa. That's what's responsible for those high HIV infection numbers there now. Sex work, prostitution, sexual behavior. But behavior is always suspicious when people think, well, you did it yourself. It's because you're promiscuous. But, well, it's not so much difference in promiscuity. Well, yes, but maybe it's concurrent relationships. People have more partners at a time. But if you check the studies, the reviews of recent studies that compared concurrency rates in sub-Saharan Africa, it's in the men, it was maybe in black men, in sub-Saharan Africa, it was about 1 to 2, on average about one partner more in 12 months. That cannot make an epidemic, especially given the vaginal transmission rates of Caucasians. It's impossible that this makes an epidemic. Oh yes, but transmission rates are higher because they have more STIs. STIs, that's what causes the transmission, both in sub-Saharan Africa and in MSM. The STIs are responsible. Well, but where do the STIs come from? Well, we don't know that. We don't know why they have so many more STIs. Maybe it's their sexual behavior. We don't really know what causes this enormous number of STIs in these groups, but that's what causes that HIV epidemic. That's what causes it. And also drugs, in MSM, drugs. Yes, they take drugs. That's what causes the epidemic. And lack of circumcision. Europeans are not cut. Chinese or Indians are not cut, but still not such a high epidemic. Migratory labor, yes, working conditions and migration in general, that's what causes that epidemic. And it all causes it. It's a multifactorial disease that HIV. It's this the epidemic is multifactorial. That should always arouse suspicion. It's a hint that the theory may be wrong. Nature is pretty simple in its mechanisms. Nature is not complex. Nothing is complex, as Einstein already knew. But now another point. How did they actually get these viruses into the rectum? Now, Burgess 2008, they succeeded in infecting mice rectally. And they write, in a recent attempt to introduce HIV-1 by a natural route, studies of Sun et al. Demonstrated the presence of HIV-1 susceptible cells in the mucosa of humanized BLT mice. They achieved successful HIV-1 infection via rectal exposure, sustained viremia with associated productive infection of lymphoid cells in different organs, and a consequent helper T-cell loss was demonstrated. However, it was necessary to cause intentional abrasion of the rectal epithelium prior to viral exposure, resulting in an artificial break of mucosal barriers. To truly mimic, now comes the joke, to truly mimic the natural and predominant model of HIV infection, or HIV-1 infection, one must demonstrate a successful infection via vaginal or rectal routes without overt epithelial abrasion. But this is not clear. This has never been shown that HIV-1 infection is or does happen in humans without overt epithelial abrasion. About a third of anoreceptive MSM have experienced bleeding, and about a third of people in South Africa have experienced bleeding in heterosexual intercourse, in vaginal intercourse. Men reported to have observed it in about 30%. The female perspective was about 26%. Blacks have a shape variant of the vagina in about 40%. women, or that number is from African Americans. 40% of them have that tight vaginal shape variant, where mucosal trauma is much more likely. About, well, at least 12 and at the most 59% of MSM have anodyspareunia, pain during intercourse, which also may indicate that their anus is too tight. And as soon as some prostitutes who are thought, or who had been thought to be immune to HIV, to the virus, as soon as they take a break from sex work and then resume sex work or sexual activity again, then they catch HIV. All those are hints that HIV infection in the human case does not happen without overt epithelial abrasion, but all this is a hint that in the high-risk groups, epithelial abrasion is quite common, and it hides. HIV is a specialist for things that hides itself, or hides very well, and also associates with things that hide very well. Now, the other joke is the way in which these abrasions were caused. In that paper that Burgess here refers to, in that paper by Sun et al., where do I have it? Intrarectal transmission, systemic infection, and CD4 positive T-cell depletion in humanized mice infected with HIV. What do they say about how they infect the mice? Intrarectal inoculations were performed essentially as previously described, using a total volume of 6 of blah 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 of virus. And then they cite, or they refer to a paper by Zeitlin and others, tests for buffer gel for contraception and prevention of sexually transmitted diseases in animal models. Now, HIV was not tested in that study, but they describe that method, how to infect such a gerbil rectally. Let's see that. And now, I'm not kidding, I now quote from that paper, Zeitlin, for tests of rectal transmission, see 57BL6 mice, other type of mice, first were anesthetized, that's nice. Then, to increase their susceptibility, an aluminum oxide coated cylinder, a 32nd inch Dremel tool, small parts include, or from such and such a firm, was inserted in the rectum and removed 15 times to simulate receptive rectal intercourse and cause mild abrasion. So they dremeled the mouse. They took a Dremel tool with something like a cylinder grinding stone, an aluminum oxide coated cylinder, and the mouse was dremeled 15 times. Performed immediately before delivery of test agents, this procedure caused no evident bleeding. Now, it may be true, but maybe it's not true. Well, because after they removed that thing, the anus is closed again. Of the anus of the mouse. Nothing happened. Just as in the human case, just as the human taboo of bleeding. No, nothing happened. I didn't see anything. People fear looking at holes. They enjoy the copulation part, but basically all people hate holes. Straight men, gay men, women themselves, all these people hate holes. All they want is the phallus. They like to smoke, they used to like to smoke. They erect columns in front of their houses. They build towers. Everyone wants the phallus, but no one wants the holes. Nobody, even straight men, don't like to. They think it's a perverse thing to look too much at that vagina. And it's dirty. It stinks. So the performer here performed immediately before delivery of test agents. This procedure caused no evident bleeding. The performer, the giver, is not interested in looking at that hole again. It's closed. Well, no bleeding. I don't see any bleeding. But. And the receptive person, or the recipient of the phallus, also sometimes does not realize the injury because he doesn't see that part. Sometimes the bleeding stops, sometimes the bleeding is hardly noticeable, sometimes one may notice it on the toilet paper. But then it is, of course, way too embarrassing and unspeakable to talk about. But this is a factor that hides. It's not only a taboo factor, but it's also a factor that escapes or flees from our eyes. And there have been some people, or many people in the meantime, to whom I tried to explain my theory, and people don't even react, or people don't even repeat those thoughts. They can't even talk about the idea of bleeding during sex. They don't talk about it. It's an unspeakable subject, and this is part of HIV's success strategy. Now, okay, so it's no surprise, this justifies my theory very much. It's no surprise that they succeeded in infecting those mice after dremeling that poor mouse's bottom. They could have infected that mouse with any virus or with any pathogen that is also transmitted via the blood way. It might have been a virus that usually only can enter only through the tip of the toe or through the earlobe, or that usually has to enter through the eye if it also can transfer via the blood direction. Because after this dremeling, after this abrasion, there was a connection to the blood circulation. And so this confirms what I say very much. But now Burgess used a different way. They boasted that they could infect the mice without breaking the mucosal barrier. And they did succeed in that, both vaginally and rectally. They could infect the mice by just inserting the pipette, a smooth pipette. It was fire polished, so they turned the glass pipette in the thin glass pipette in the fire of a Bunsen burner probably, and the glass melts and gets smooth, and they could infect them. But as I said, vaginally was easier than rectally, which shows that it is an adequate model, that this humanized mice model is an inadequate model for human HIV transmission or infection. It may serve the purpose of explaining pathogenesis and other things around HIV, but it's not a good or adequate model for HIV transmission if vaginal transmission is easier than rectal transmission. But there is one small objection, or one minor objection, which I could raise here. Mice were allowed in this study to defecate prior to rectal inoculation so as to prevent immediate expulsion of the virus. So there could have been the abrasions, possibly. Talked about this, I talked about that. Yes, those who did not succeed in infecting the mice via the rectal route, again, engraftment was not perfect, and they also didn't describe how they inoculated the mice. Maybe they didn't have a Dremel ready, so they didn't Dremel that mouse. I wonder whether the PI of that study, of that Dremel study, where they originally described that method, I wonder whether the PI was gay. Because if he was, he's suffering from a really severe case of anal stenosis if he imagines that a Dremel should be used in order to simulate anal-receptive intercourse. That's oh my god. Always remember that these people make a living for doing that. What was that? Yes, this is the paper which they have wrongly cited, where they only use an intraperitoneal injection of the virus. There is no attempt at rectal or vaginal transmission, so it was cited wrongly in that review by Denton and Garcia. Again, always remember that these people make a living from that they actually get money for writing such papers and for dremeling mice. And what was that? Yes, there they could infect via the vaginal route, and they didn't try rectal transmission. And now this is the paper where they succeeded in vaginal and rectal mucosal transmission with that smooth pipette. The only minor objection I have here is maybe the defecation process just before inoculating. That could be an equivalent, not of the Dremel. I don't think it led to that much damage. But again, my first objection remains also for that paper, or major objection. It's not a good model for the human infection process, as soon as vaginal transmission is easier, or even as easy as rectal transmission. Again, it was also one of my points in the other videos to make clear that vaginal transmission is probably as probable as rectal transmission in sub-Saharan Africa or in African Americans. It's about the striking difference between vaginal transmission and rectal transmission is valid for Caucasians, but not for blacks.